In my last couple of videos, I've been talking about suppressing trauma, how some of us, especially people like me, have the ability to really push down their negative emotions and to not think about the things that they've been through. And although this can be successful in the sense that you'll be far more functional than the people who are held captive by their negative emotions and constantly transported back to the moments of their trauma and their PTSD and things like that, unfortunately, some of the negatives can outweigh the positives. And in this video, I really wanted to break down those negative side effects in a little bit more detail to give greater understanding to those people who are suppressing their trauma, not only to help them realize, hopefully, that they do need to learn how to process their trauma in a proper way, but also to encourage people who maybe are tempted by this. They've been through something traumatic and they don't want to think about it. They are attempting to suppress what happened to them. Maybe to encourage them to realize that although that is immediately, in the short term, it definitely is easier and it could be a lot better for you mentally and in the way that you function. Long term, it could be very damaging. So the first kind of big reason of why it's not good to suppress your trauma is that the majority of people are not like me. The majority of people cannot actually do this. So even though they'll try, what they'll end up doing is they'll end up simply suppressing things for a time, and then those emotions and those negative memories will come back. Unfortunately, an even bigger problem that can happen is that some people are capable of suppressing the anchors for their trauma, but not the side effects or the symptoms of their trauma. And this is what I mean. For the person who actually is in PTSD and they are reliving their trauma over and over again, whether it is in nightmares or through flashbacks and triggers and things like that, that person, they're in a bad state. Don't get me wrong. That's a really, really negative place to be. It's not fun and it is very damaging. However, at least they're reacting to something that they're aware of. Some people, in an attempt to suppress their trauma, they'll actually convince themselves that what happened to them actually doesn't bother them. They'll convince themselves that these things are in the past and that they're no longer impacting their present. Although simply because they're telling themselves this doesn't mean it's actually occurring. And therefore, they're still having the symptoms of PTSD. They just don't know what these symptoms are reacting to. So for instance, even though I didn't get PTSD, I can relate to this a little bit. I realized that I was just a far angrier person. I got angry all the time at just a drop of the hat. I became more and more aggressive, more and more violent, and yet I didn't know why. Because I had totally forgotten about my trauma, I had totally suppressed it in such a way, whereas even though I wasn't remembering why I was so angry, now I was just angry. I was just angry at everything. That was the state of being that I lived in and day out. This could be even more damaging for someone who actually does have triggers, like legitimate triggers happening to them, and they really do have PTSD or some sort of trauma-based disorder, and yet they're completely denying their trauma. They're completely trying to convince themselves that these traumatic things that happened to them in the past are no longer holding any sway over them. And so because of that, they're in a worse spot than somebody who actually is reliving their past because their state is negative, but they don't know why. The next thing that can happen is, even for those who are successful in suppressing their trauma, it can result in a lack of love and a lack of care or compassion for others. The reason why is because if you think about it, the emotions that we have, things like sadness, grief, fear, caution, even anger, all these emotions really do stem from love, meaning that if you think about sadness for a second, what is it that causes sadness? Well, sadness is the reactive emotion that you have when something that you love or care about is taken away from you. Once that thing is lost, your emotions respond to that loss through grief. And that grief actually lets you know that you actually did care for or love that person or that thing that has now been removed from your life. So for instance, for me, if my wife all of a sudden died tonight, and I wasn't moved emotionally at all. I had no amount of sorrow or grief within my body at all. That would prove to me that I didn't really care about my wife. If she could die and I could just tomorrow say, oh well, I'll just find another wife, that proves to me that my care for her, my love for her is more fiction than it is real. So when we suppress things like grief and sadness, what we may be doing is we may be suppressing the source of those emotions, which is love and care. If you think about it, it plays out in your language. So if you say things to yourself all the time like, I don't care, it doesn't bother me, if I lose this person or I lose a thing, it's no big deal. What that's revealing to you is that the reason why you don't feel sad if these things are taken away from you, or the reason why you don't feel sad that things have been taken away from you, is because you didn't care about them in the first place. This also works the same way with fear. If someone's suppressing fear, we have to remember that fear has a good place in your life. Not only does it protect you from reckless living, but it also, again, demonstrates a certain amount of caution that you have for the people that you love. I couldn't honestly say that I cared about my wife or my marriage if I had no amount of caution or concern for how that relationship was going. It wouldn't regulate the way that I behave, it wouldn't regulate the way that I protect the marriage, and it wouldn't even regulate the way that I protect my wife or try to look out for her well-being. These emotions are actually good things. They are responses to love. So what I realized over time is that the more I was suppressing the negative emotions, I was actually suppressing love in general. I found myself to be far less loving and more narcissistic, meaning self-absorbed, than I ever was before. And once again, this doesn't mean that anyone who suppresses their emotions will necessarily turn into a sociopath, but I am saying that there are levels, and the level that you're able to suppress your emotions is the same level that your love is going to be non-existent. So I was pretty successful, which means that the ability I had to care for others was very low, almost non-existent at the time that I was doing this. And it really took a wake-up call for me to realize, this isn't healthy, this isn't good. Why don't I care about the people in my life? Why don't I have concern for their well-being? And that's really what it took to get me to the place where I realized I don't want to be like this anymore. The other thing that I realized is it took away my ability to have empathy. So empathy is the ability to feel what someone else feels. So when someone else is going through sadness or grief, they don't really need you to pull them out of that in the moment. They don't really need you to be able to give them some good solution or to make them laugh. What they actually need is they need empathy. They need someone to come alongside them, to comfort them, and to enter into their sorrow and sadness so that they can walk through that sadness with them. That's a really beautiful thing that someone's able to do. However, if you're someone like me that always runs from emotion, if you make jokes out of your pain and suffering and you can't take things seriously, then when someone else is feeling sad, when they're crying, it's going to do to you what it did to me. Whenever someone was sad around me, it made me feel uncomfortable. I felt like I had to break the tension with some sort of a joke. I would tell people to get over things. I would say, hey, here's a straw, suck it up. It's not a big deal. Bad things happen to all of us, right? I didn't know how to have compassion on other people. I didn't know how to have empathy, and I certainly didn't know how to comfort. And that was a really negative thing, because comfort is one of the things that bring nearness to humanity. It really does bring people close. And we'll certainly talk about that much more later when we talk about how to properly process our grief and our sadness. The next thing that I realized it was doing to me is it was taking away my ability to have hope. So in the Marines, we had a saying, it was from Dante's Inferno, where in Dante's Inferno, before he enters into hell, above hell it had this sign that said, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And that's what we said in the Marines. It's kind of a joke towards one another, that when you're in the military, you got to abandon all hope. The reason why is because the military had this really nasty habit of getting our hopes up only to bring them crashing to the ground. So and anyone who's been in the military, you'll resonate with what I'm about to say. The military has this nasty habit of promising you things that it never actually comes through with. So they promise you that things are going to get better and they only get worse. They promise you that when you go out to the field, we're going to have the equipment that you need, everything's going to be taken care of, but then you get out there and you realize that you don't have jackets when it's cold, you don't have tents when it's raining, you don't have enough food, you don't have enough water, and then they promise you vacations that never really come. They'll say, hey, we got a 96 coming up in 2 weeks, make your vacation plans. And a 96, by the way, is a 4-day weekend. So we'd all be planning and prepping for this 96-hour weekend, and then what happens? At the last minute, they say, hey, we just figured out that we're doing a training op that weekend, or hey, we just figured out that something else is going on, so it's not going to happen. What that initially did to us is it just took away our ability to hope. It took away our ability to have passion for things. We instead became hopeless. We became despondent. We were like, oh, okay, it's worthless to hope for things, because hope is just delayed dissatisfaction or delayed disappointment. So we didn't hope. We just kind of took things on the chin and we accepted the world the way it was. And that's what, again, caused us to use phrases like, it is what it is, it doesn't really matter, I don't care. Which sounds good, because when you have someone who's like that, once again, they don't get disappointed very easily. They don't get their hopes up, only have them crash down. They are more functional. However, people like this are also not very passionate about things. hope at its core is just a passionate desire for something that you want. It's the key to purpose. It's the key to ambition. It's the key to moving forward in your life. Without any hope, what do you have left is something that we call despair. And at least the final thing that I realized it was doing to me, it was growing my depression. So I've always struggled with depression since I was a very young person, probably around like 12 or 13. And what I didn't understand at the time was that depression isn't necessarily feeling sad. Depression is feeling numb. The opposite of depression certainly isn't happiness. The opposite of depression is emotional vitality or will. And so when you think about depression, depression is this state of numbness, the state where everything feels distant, far away, like nothing feels real to you, nothing feels vibrant. It's like the color in the world is sapped out of it. It feels like people that you're reacting to, you don't really feel like they're actually there. You feel like life is happening to you as opposed to you actually happening to life. It's a very difficult thing to explain to someone who's never been through it. But when you're in a depressed state, you don't care about things. Everything feels difficult. The joy is sapped out of your life. You don't feel like doing things, even simple things like eating, sleeping, talking to friends and family. All those things feel like labor and effort, and you just don't want to do it. What I realized is that my depression was getting worse. Why? Because I was, in a sense, feeding my depression so that I didn't have to deal with these more negative emotions. So I became a far more depressed person. I became far more apathetic towards everything, and it was sapping away really my life and my vitality. It wasn't good. So again, I was functional. I wasn't being controlled by my past in the way that someone with PTSD is, but I was certainly not as functional as I could have been. So once again, I'm not saying for those people who have this type of coping mechanism that, hey, now you got to dig into your past and figure it out. But what I am saying is, if it was possible for you to process what's happened to you in a more healthy way, to move past it as opposed to pushing it down when you want to. And in future videos, I'll talk more about how to do that, but you have to have it in your mind that you're willing to do this, because it's not easy. It's not easy to go through your past. It's not easy to process things that are traumatic. It is far easier to just pretend like these things don't bother you. But once again, it's not always what's easy that is what's best. So look forward to my future video. I wanted to take an entire video to talk about suppressing guilt, because that's another really negative thing. And then hopefully in a couple weeks, we'll start getting into the more practical ways that we can deal with our trauma. So look forward to those. Hey, this is Peter Martin, and if you've just finished this video, that means that you've watched one in a longer playlist on my new book called Fellowship of Suffering. This book deals with trauma and PTSD and how these things impact all of us. So if you've liked this video, please give it a like, please subscribe to my channel, and look forward to more content.